The makeup artist's hands trembled as she blended foundation across Jasmine's jawline. Not the usual tremor of someone nervous about their work. This was different. This was the shake of someone recognizing a truth nobody was supposed to see. Jasmine felt it immediately. That subtle pause when the brush caught the edge of the bruise spreading like watercolor across her skin. The artist's eyes flickered, just for a moment, long enough to confirm what she already knew. The damage was visible even underneath. The swelling along her left cheekbone refused to cooperate. The purple-black shadows beneath her skin were too deep for 3 days of concealer to handle. The artist said nothing. She simply reached for another layer. Then another. In the mirror, Jasmine watched her own face disappear. The real face. Scarred. Broken. Defeated. Melted away under careful application. What stared back at her was a stranger. Someone who belonged in a ballroom. Someone who could handle the life waiting downstairs. Someone who wasn't screaming internally. She was 26 years old and had become an expert at vanishing. The Peninsula Hotel's bridal suite smelled like roses and money. White flowers cascaded from every corner. Light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, where Jasmine had once felt safe. That safety had died, along with her parents 4 years ago. Everything that came after was just smoke and mirrors. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Her mother stood in the corner, wearing the kind of smile reserved for funerals and court appearances. Margaret Chen had perfected the art of looking present while being completely absent. She'd been absent the day the bank accounts disappeared. Absent when the man downstairs first hit her. Absent through 7 years of a cage disguised as fortune. "You look absolutely stunning," Margaret whispered, gripping the veil with fingers that had stopped shaking somewhere around the 3rd year of this arrangement. Survival required adjusting to the unthinkable. Margaret had adjusted beautifully. Jasmine wasn't sure which of them had lost more. The wedding dress hung from Jasmine's frame like it belonged to someone else entirely. $47,000 of hand-sewn pearls and imported silk. The price tag was meant to impress everyone downstairs. But all Jasmine felt was its weight. Each pearl seemed to press harder against her skin, reminding her that she was a purchase, not a bride, a possession. "Everything ready?" Margaret's voice cracked slightly. She still had some human left in her then. Jasmine filed that observation away. It might matter later. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jasmine said, and the lie came so smoothly it terrified her. 7 years of rehearsing this moment. 7 years of learning which words would keep her alive, and which ones would make him angry. She'd become fluent in deception, bilingual in survival. The makeup artist stepped back, studying her work like a crime scene investigator examining evidence. More than 20 minutes had passed, more than 3 applications of foundation, more than enough layers to hide what lived underneath. She'd turned Jasmine's destroyed face into a masterpiece. "There," the artist said softly, her voice carrying something Jasmine couldn't quite name. Pity? Guilt? Resignation? All of them, probably. "You're perfect." Jasmine stared at her reflection. The woman looking back was someone she'd never met. Flawless skin. Bright eyes that somehow still managed to sparkle. A smile that didn't reveal the damage beneath. This was the version that Victor wanted. The version that would sit beside him while 400 people watched and believed a love story that didn't exist. Downstairs, She could hear the string quartet tuning their instruments. Pachelbel's canon waited to play as she walked down an aisle she'd never chosen to walk. The timeline was set. The stage was built. The performance was about to begin, and Jasmine was the reluctant star. She stood, careful not to move too quickly. Her ribs complained. 2 were still healing from 4 days ago, when he'd been frustrated about a shipment that arrived late. She'd learned to move through pain the way other people move through air, invisible, soundless, making no ripple in the life of the man who owned her. The dress settled around her like water, cold, heavy, suffocating. "Let's go," Margaret said, and it sounded like a funeral march. As Jasmine turned toward the door, she caught the makeup artist watching her in the mirror. Their eyes met for just a second, long enough to see something breaking inside someone else. The artist looked away first. Everyone always did. Jasmine descended the stairs toward her wedding, and didn't notice her hands were shaking so badly the bouquet of white roses trembled like they were alive. She didn't notice her breathing had become shallow. She didn't notice how the ballroom seemed to tilt at angles that shouldn't exist. All she could focus on was the figure waiting at the end of the aisle, tall, immaculate, smiling like a man who'd just won something valuable. Viktor Kozlov looked at her with eyes that held centuries of control. He looked at her the way a collector looks at a newly acquired piece, something that belonged to him now, something that would never leave his possession. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Jasmine heard a sound like breaking glass, like the moment before everything falls apart, like the moment before secrets stop being secrets. But the music started, the crowd rose, and Jasmine walked forward, carrying her hidden truth with every careful step. What Viktor didn't know was that truth was about to become impossible to hide. 3,000 guests had no idea that the woman walking down the aisle was attending her own execution. The flowers smelled like death. That's what Jasmine thought as she moved through the applause. Each step measured, each breath calculated, each moment a lie wrapped in silk and jewels. Nobody could tell by looking at her that she'd spent the last 40 minutes in a hospital bathroom at 6 a.m., checking to see if her ribs were still intact. Nobody could see that the hand gripping the bouquet was actually gripping it so hard to keep from shaking that her fingernails had drawn blood from her own palm. Viktor stood at the altar like he was born to stand there, like the universe had arranged itself around his presence. He wore custom tailoring that probably cost more than a car. His dark eyes tracked her approach with the hunger of someone who'd planned this moment for months, not because he loved her, because he owned her, and today the entire city would watch him sign the legal paperwork. The vows hung in the air like poison. Jasmine heard words, her own voice saying them, which meant some part of her was still functioning. But they meant nothing. She'd lost the ability to attach meaning to language around year 3 of the arrangement. Language was just sound, just survival, just the necessary noise that kept her breathing. But then the pastor asked the question that made everything stop. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" Viktor smiled, not with his mouth, with his eyes. The kind of smile that meant he was remembering what he'd done to make sure she'd say yes. The kind of smile that meant he was anticipating what would happen later, when the cameras were gone and the guests had left, and she was alone with him in the honeymoon suite. "I do," he said, and his voice carried the kind of certainty that came from owning something completely. The reception exploded into celebration. Champagne flowed. A 20-piece orchestra began playing. The ballroom, already transformed into something from a luxury magazine. became the background for 1,000 photographs. Jasmine stood beside Victor, her hand never leaving his arm, because he'd trained her to understand that letting go carried consequences. At some point, a photographer approached. Tall, nervous energy, carrying equipment like it was made of glass. He wanted a candid shot, something natural, something that showed the newlyweds in love. Victor's hand tightened on her lower back. Not enough for anyone to notice, just enough for her to feel the pressure, just enough to remind her exactly what would happen if she didn't smile convincingly enough. "Come here," he whispered, pulling her close in a way that looked romantic to every person watching. In reality, his grip was a warning, a promise, a threat wrapped in the language of affection. Jasmine smiled, her lips moved, her eyes brightened. Every muscle in her face performed the role it had been designed to play. The camera flashed, captured. This moment, this lie, would exist in someone's camera roll forever. Proof that she'd been happy. Proof that she'd chosen this. Except she'd never had a choice. When Victor leaned in to whisper something in her ear, it was meant to be playful, romantic. Something the photographer might capture as a sweet moment between newlyweds. But what he actually said was, "After we leave here, I'm going to remind you why you belong to me." His words were fire. His breath was warm. And somewhere in the background, the orchestra kept playing like nothing in the world was wrong. That's when Jasmine felt it. Not emotion, not fear, something more fundamental, something mechanical. Her body was shutting down. The champagne she'd been forced to drink had mixed badly with the anxiety medication she'd taken to keep her hands steady. The lights were too bright. The room was too warm. The pressure in her chest was building toward something she couldn't control. She excused herself to the bathroom, then to the bar for water, then to a quiet corner, because suddenly the ballroom felt like it was closing in. The walls were getting closer. The air was getting thinner. Her vision was starting to do something strange, like reality was pulling away from her, like she was standing outside her own body, watching herself pretend to be someone's wife. The photographer was still following, still capturing. 12 different angles, 100 different moments. All of them lies, all of them proof of something that wasn't true. Jasmine tried to move toward the dance floor, tried to smile for Victor, who was watching from across the room with the patience of someone who'd learned a long time ago that he could wait. He could always wait. She wasn't going anywhere. But her legs didn't listen. The room tilted. The lights separated into individual points. The music became something distant and strange. She was dimly aware of Victor moving through the crowd toward her, but even his movement seemed to be happening underwater. Everything was slow. Everything was floating. Jasmine reached out to steady herself against a table, and her hand passed through the space where the table should have been. That's when she understood what was happening. Not that she was falling, that she was already gone. Victor caught her as she collapsed. 400 people gasped. The orchestra stopped playing. And in that moment of absolute silence, with her face inches from his chest, Jasmine understood something with crystal clarity. Whatever happened next, everything was about to change. The hospital fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that made Jasmine's teeth ache. She'd been unconscious for 8 hours. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she registered was the whiteness of everything. White walls, white ceiling, white linens, like she'd died, and nobody had bothered to tell her yet. The second thing she registered was the absence of makeup. It was gone, all of it. Someone, a nurse, a technician, the universe itself, had washed it away. And with the makeup gone, everything she'd spent 6 hours that morning hiding was now completely visible on the pillow beside her head. The bruising on her jaw was catastrophic, a deep purple-black that had probably been red yesterday. Her left eye was swollen to the point of being almost closed. There was a cut across her cheekbone, from his signet ring probably. She'd stopped keeping track of the weapons, that had stopped bleeding sometime in the last few hours. She was a landscape of damage. Jasmine tried to sit up, but her body disagreed violently. Pain shot through her ribs. Not a sharp pain. Something deeper. Something that suggested something significant was broken on the inside. She lay back down slowly, understanding without being told that movement had consequences. The machines beside her bed beeped in patterns she didn't understand. IV stands stood like sentinels. Monitors tracked things she couldn't see but could hear. Her heartbeat, her oxygen levels, all the mechanical proof that she was still, technically, alive. A nurse came in, an older black woman with gray threading through her braids, with eyes that had clearly seen too much of the same story repeated over and over. She didn't look directly at Jasmine's face as she checked the machines and adjusted the IV, but Jasmine caught the moment her eyes registered the full extent of the injuries. That micro-expression, that quick inward flinch, that moment of recognition that came from having seen this exact pattern before. "How long have I been here?" Jasmine's voice came out wrong, hoarse, like she'd been screaming, even though she'd been unconscious. 8 hours, the nurse said. Her voice was careful, professional. The kind of care that came from knowing there were certain questions she couldn't ask, and certain answers she had to pretend not to already know. "You collapsed at your wedding reception. Dehydration, anxiety, possible malnutrition over an extended period. We ran tests. Your blood pressure was critically low. Extended period." The nurse knew. Of course the nurse knew. A woman doesn't show up to a hospital with this specific constellation of injuries and have it be an accident. But knowing and being able to do something about it were two completely different things. Jasmine had learned that much from existing inside Victor's world. The system that was supposed to protect people often just watched them suffer. "Has anyone come to see me?" Jasmine's stomach tightened. If Victor had been here, he would have already started making his narrative, already started planting the seeds. A worried husband, a devoted man, a concerned fiancé turned concerned husband. The story would be perfect by now. "Your husband called, wanted to come by, but we told him visiting hours were over. He seemed very concerned." The nurse's tone didn't change, but her hands gripped the blood pressure cuff with more force than necessary. "Said you have a history of fainting spells. Said you sometimes struggle with your mental health." There it was. The narrative is already taking shape. Fainting spells. Mental health issues. The kind of explanation that turned a victim into a problem. The kind of story that made people nod sympathetically and never ask follow-up questions. Jasmine closed her eyes and wanted to scream. Wanted to grab this nurse by the shoulders and tell her the truth. But she'd learned a long time ago that telling the truth was the fastest way to make things worse. Telling the truth meant retaliation. Telling the truth meant he'd isolate her even further. Telling the truth meant she would disappear in ways that mattered. "I appreciate you," Jasmine said quietly, and meant it with every part of herself that still knew how to feel. The nurse studied her for a long moment. Then she placed a card on the nightstand. It had a phone number and a website. "Domestic violence resources," she said quietly, without making eye contact, "just in case you ever need them." And then she was gone, back to her rounds, back to whatever other patients needed her. back to the thousand ways she probably wanted to help, but couldn't. Jasmine lay in the hospital bed and felt something inside her crack open. Not in a healing way. In a way that suggested she was falling apart, even while the machines insisted she was stable. That's when he arrived. The man in the doorway didn't announce himself, because he didn't have to. The way the nurses suddenly moved faster. The way the hallway conversations stopped. The way the air pressure in the room seemed to change. These were the things that announced him. Dmitry Volkov stood 6'3" in a custom-tailored suit that made Victor's wedding clothes look cheap. But it wasn't the suit that made people instinctively move out of his way. It was something in his eyes, something that suggested this man had seen violence and made peace with it. Something that suggested crossing him was a choice people only made once. He looked at Jasmine lying in the hospital bed, bruised, exposed, destroyed, and every muscle in his body went absolutely still. For a long moment, he didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. He simply stared at her face like he was reading a language written in bruises, like he was understanding something that shattered every belief he'd held on to. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that came right before violence. Jasmine couldn't answer. Her throat had closed. Her body was already starting to lock down, anticipating retaliation for speaking the truth to the wrong person. Dmitry moved closer, and every instinct Jasmine possessed screamed at her to move away. But she couldn't. The injuries had left her trapped. She could only lie there and watch his face transform as he understood the full extent of her situation. "How long?" he asked, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I can't," Jasmine said, and meant it. "I can't talk about this. If he finds out I talked about this—" "He won't," Dmitry said, and it wasn't a promise. It was a guarantee spoken by someone who had the power to guarantee things. "Because I'm getting you out, and when I'm done with him, he'll never touch you again." She should have been terrified, should have been calling for the nurse, should have been doing anything but believing a man she barely knew who was standing in a hospital room making promises that sounded like threats. But all Jasmine felt was something that might have been hope, and that terrified her more than anything else. The safe house sat in the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business. Clean streets, expensive cars in driveways, the kind of place where neighbors didn't ask questions about who was coming and going because asking questions could get you hurt. Jasmine had been there for 17 hours. She'd spent the first 6 in Dmitry's car, riding in absolute silence while he made phone calls she didn't understand in a language she didn't recognize. She'd spent the next 8 in a shower, trying to wash away the hospital smell and the wedding stench and the 7 years of accumulated fear that had soaked so deeply into her skin that she wasn't sure hot water could ever actually reach it. She'd spent the last 3 staring at a wall. The safe house had everything. Security cameras, monitors showing feeds from multiple angles, a kitchen stocked with foods she actually wanted to eat instead of foods selected by someone else, clean clothes that fit, a bathroom without anyone standing outside it, listening. It was, technically, everything she'd dreamed of having. Freedom to move without permission. Freedom to exist without performance. Freedom that terrified her more than captivity ever had. Dmitry appeared in the doorway like he always did, without knocking, without warning, just materializing like he'd stepped through the wall itself. He was holding a folder, and his expression suggested it contained something she wasn't going to like. "I need you to understand something," he said, sitting down across from her at the kitchen table. He opened the folder. Inside were documents, legal papers, bank statements, photographs. Victor didn't just take control of your life. He stole your entire inheritance. We're talking about $4.2 billion that should have been yours. It's in accounts spread across 6 countries, moved through shell companies, hidden behind layers of lawyers and corporate fiction. Jasmine stared at the numbers. They looked like hallucinations. Too large to be real. Too many zeros to mean anything. There's more, Dmitri continued. The federal government has been investigating Victor for the last 3 years. Money laundering, organized crime, human trafficking. They've been building a case. We're just waiting for the right moment to make it public. Why are you telling me this? Jasmine's voice came out small, fragile, like she'd forgotten how to use her voice for anything other than agreement. Because you need to understand that Victor isn't just a controlling man. He's not just someone who hurts people. He's built an entire empire on making people disappear. And he's not going to let you leave quietly. Dmitri's words hung in the air like weapons. Jasmine felt them landing in her chest, each one a small detonation. What happens now? She asked, and discovered she was shaking. Now, you decide. Dmitri leaned back in his chair. You can leave. I have contacts. I can set you up anywhere in the world. New identity, new life, complete separation from everything you knew. Or, he paused, letting the words settle between them. Or what? Jasmine whispered. Or you let me finish this. Let me make sure he can never hurt you or anyone else again. Let me reclaim what's yours. Jasmine understood what he was really offering. It wasn't safety. Safety would involve disappearing. What he was offering was power. What he was offering was the chance to watch the man who'd destroyed her watch his own world collapse. What he was offering was revenge. And somewhere in the deepest part of herself, the part that had survived by staying silent, by staying small, by staying invisible, Jasmine felt something ignite. Before she could speak, Dmitri's phone rang. He answered in that same unfamiliar language. His body changed. The casual way he'd been sitting disappeared. He sat up straighter, his hand clenched into a fist. They found the first server, he said, ending the call. The evidence is worse than we thought. He stood and moved to one of the monitors, pulling up footage from somewhere. Security camera video. An office. Victor's office. And there, on the screen, was the man himself, Victor Kozlov, with his hands around another woman's throat. That's his second wife, Dmitri said quietly. The one who disappeared 3 years ago. The police classified her as a runaway. But she didn't run. She just ended. Jasmine understood what he was telling her. There were other victims. There had always been other victims. She'd just been the only one who hadn't disappeared completely. The only one who'd survived long enough to tell anyone what had actually happened. I'm going to stop him, Dmitri said, and it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. I'm going to burn down everything he's built. I'm going to make sure every person he's ever hurt knows he's going to pay. But I need you to understand what that means. It means my entire organization is about to go to war with his. It means there will be consequences, and it means the only way this works is if you're completely certain you want this. Jasmine looked at the woman on the screen, at the bruises on her neck, at the fear frozen in her expression in that final moment before she vanished. She thought about the makeup artist's trembling hands. She thought about the nurse who'd left that card on her nightstand. She thought about every woman who'd probably stood exactly where she was standing, facing this exact choice. Do it, Jasmine said. Burn it all down. And in saying those words, she understood she was choosing a future that nobody could guarantee. The waiting was worse than the actual danger. Jasmine had been sequestered in the safe house for 4 days. Dmitri came and went with the kind of frequency that suggested something was accelerating toward its conclusion. His team, and yes, she'd discovered he had an entire team, trained and loyal in a way that suggested decades of organization, moved through the house like ghosts. They didn't speak to her, not out of rudeness, out of professionalism, out of the understanding that in situations like this, unnecessary communication could get people killed. She'd been given a phone, a burner, a way to contact the outside world that couldn't be traced. She'd used it to call the hospital, asking if any nurses named Chen worked there. When they said yes, she'd left a message. "I'm safe. Thank you for the card. I'm going to be okay." She didn't know if the message would reach the right person, but the attempt felt like reclaiming something. On day 4, Dmitri sat down across from her and didn't open with logistics. "I need to tell you something about me," he said, and his expression suggested this was something that cost him to say. "About what I've done, about what I am." He told her about working for Victor, about the years spent doing things he couldn't describe, about witnessing violence and becoming capable of it himself, about a woman he'd tried to save and failed, about walking away 5 years ago and building a legitimate business empire to try to make that failure mean something. "I'm not a good person," Dmitri said, and his voice was steady. No apology hidden beneath the words. Just truth. "I've done things that will follow me for the rest of my life. But I'm also the only person in the world with the resources and the knowledge to stop Victor without letting him hide. To burn away the protection that money and power usually provides." Jasmine listened. Really listened. Not the way people usually listen, waiting for their turn to speak, but the way someone listens when their entire life depends on understanding what they're hearing. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why help me? You didn't know me. You don't owe me anything." "Because when I walked into that hospital room and saw your face, I saw her," Dmitri said. "The woman I couldn't save. And this time, I'm not walking away." It was an answer that should have terrified her. An answer that meant his motivation wasn't pure. His intentions weren't clean. His desire to help her was tangled up with his need to fix something that had broken him years ago. But Jasmine understood something that most people with the luxury of safe lives never learned. Sometimes salvation didn't come from good people. Sometimes it came from damaged people who had the skills to recognize damage and the power to respond to it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the message and her heart stopped. It was from a number she recognized. "Victor, I miss you," the message said. "Come home. We can fix this." Dmitri looked at her phone. I looked at her face, understood immediately what the message meant. "He found out where you are," he said. And it wasn't a question. "That means his next move is coming faster than we anticipated." He made a call, spoke in rapid-fire language. I ended it and stood. "We're moving you," he said. "We're taking this to the end tonight. Either this ends or it doesn't. There's no middle ground anymore." Jasmine felt her hands shake as she stuffed her few belongings into a bag. She had no idea where they were going, had no idea what the end actually looked like, had no idea if she would survive what came next. But she knew this much. She was about to find out if it was possible to take back your life once someone else had claimed ownership of it. And whatever happened next would change everything. Dmitri was already at the door, already moving into action, already becoming the version of himself that Victor had created all those years ago. And Jasmine understood that she was about to watch something break open that had been sealed shut for longer than she could remember. As they moved into the night, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Victor. "You're making a mistake," it said. "Come back, and I'll forgive you. Try to run, and I'll make sure you regret it." Jasmine deleted it, turned off the phone, and stepped into the darkness beside Dmitry Volkov, understanding that she'd just crossed the final threshold between her old life and whatever came next. And there was no going back. The federal agents moved like water through Victor's downtown penthouse, synchronized, silent, methodical in the way only professionals who'd trained together for years could be. Jasmine watched from the monitoring station Dmitry had set up, watching her husband's world collapse in real time on 12 different screens. It had taken exactly 2 hours from the moment they'd contacted the FBI to the moment the raid started. 2 hours of Dmitry making calls, of his team positioning themselves at strategic points, of the evidence being handed over to people with the authority to act on it. The moment the federal agents got to Victor's office, they found exactly what Dmitry had promised they'd find: servers containing years of transaction records, files documenting every illegal operation, photographs of victims, banking information that traced money through 7 different countries. Victor's face when they came through his door was something Jasmine would remember for the rest of her life. Not fear. Shock. The look of a man realizing that the armor he'd spent decades building wasn't actually armor at all. It was just an illusion, and someone had finally seen through it. "What are you looking at?" Dmitry appeared beside Jasmine without making a sound. He'd mastered the art of movement the way other people mastered conversation. Invisible, until he chose to be visible. "Him," Jasmine said, pointing at the screen where Victor was being read his rights. "I'm looking at him, finally understanding that he's not untouchable." Dmitry studied the screen with the expression of someone watching an old enemy finally face consequences. Not satisfaction. Not revenge, just closure. The kind that came from understanding that some things needed to be destroyed to protect others. "That's the first part," he said quietly. "The legal destruction, federal charges, white-collar crime, money laundering, human trafficking. They'll keep him in custody while they build the case. The trial alone will take 2 years, and once the evidence gets into public record, everyone he's ever worked with, every person who's ever protected him, they're all going to have to make a choice: stand with him and go down together, or testify against him and save themselves." Jasmine understood what he was telling her. This wasn't just about Victor. This was about an entire ecosystem that had existed to protect him, and that ecosystem was about to fracture. "What happens to me?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. "You become a witness," Dmitry said. "You testify about what he did. You provide the personal evidence that shows this wasn't just financial crime. This was violence. This was control. This was systematic abuse." The word witness hung between them. It meant stepping into a courtroom. It meant facing Victor across the room while she described what he'd done. It meant having every moment of her pain examined and questioned and analyzed by lawyers whose job was to make her seem unreliable. It meant giving up the idea of disappearing and instead choosing to be completely, vulnerably visible. "I'll do it," Jasmine said. Dmitry looked at her for a long moment. "I need you to understand something," he said. "When you testify, he's going to try to destroy you. His lawyers are going to try to make you seem unstable. They're going to bring up your medical history. They're going to suggest you're lying for money. They're going to attack everything about you. And you're going to have to sit there and take it while everyone in the courtroom watches." "I understand," Jasmine said. "Do you?" Dimitri's voice had changed, softened. Because I've already destroyed one person trying to save them, I'm not going to let that happen again. Jasmine realized what he was telling her. This wasn't just about justice. This was about him. About the woman he'd tried to save years ago and couldn't. About his need to actually succeed this time. And she understood something else. She was about to become part of his healing, whether she wanted to be or not. I'm stronger than I look, she said quietly. I know, Dimitri replied. You survived him. That alone proves you're stronger than most people will ever be. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. She almost didn't open it, but something made her look. When she read the words, her blood turned to ice. You think you've won, the message said, but you have no idea what I'm capable of. I'm going to destroy everything you love. I'm going to make you regret every second of this betrayal. The message was from Victor, which meant even sitting in federal custody with agents surrounding him, even with his entire operation collapsing, he was still finding ways to threaten her, still finding ways to maintain control. Dimitri saw her face change, saw her hands start to shake. He was reading the message before she could even speak. That's evidence, he said, and his voice had shifted into something colder. That's him making direct threats against a federal witness. That's going to add years to whatever sentence he gets. But Jasmine wasn't thinking about the legal implications. She was thinking about the part where he said he was going to destroy everything she loved. She was thinking about what that meant. She was thinking about the fact that Victor had always kept his promises, no matter how long it took or how much it cost him. And she was realizing that even though they'd arrested him, even though they'd seized his assets and his files and his power, the most dangerous part was just beginning. Dimitri made a call, spoke in that language she still didn't understand, ended it, and turned to her. We're moving again, he said. We're not taking any chances. As they began packing, as the team started dismantling the safe house, as everything shifted into emergency protocol, Jasmine understood something fundamental. Victor had been right about one thing. She had no idea what he was capable of. And neither did anyone else. The second safe house was different, smaller, less permanent. The kind of place that existed for one purpose, to vanish people when everything had gone wrong. It sat outside the city, surrounded by woods, with a single road leading in and out. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Dimitri walked her through the security systems like she was someone who understood tactical operations, which she wasn't. She understood survival, but survival and tactics were different languages entirely. Still, she listened. Still, she tried to understand what he was showing her. If anything happens, he said, showing her a panic button disguised as a bathroom light switch, you push this. The team knows where you are. They'll be here in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That's how long it took to save her if something went wrong. 4 minutes of being alone with whoever decided to come for her in the dark. Will that be enough? She asked. Dimitri didn't answer right away, which was its own answer. I'm going to make sure nothing happens, he said finally. I have people watching the roads. I have people monitoring law enforcement communications. I have people tracking every person connected to Victor's organization. The moment anyone tries to move against you, I'll know about it. Jasmine wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his power and resources were enough to protect her. But she'd learned something from living with Victor. Power was always conditional. Power could always be taken away. Power could always fail at exactly the moment you needed it most. Tell me about the woman, she said quietly. The one you couldn't save. Dmitri was silent for a long time, long enough that Jasmine thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he walked to the window and looked out at the dark woods beyond. Her name was Alicia, he said. She was married to one of Victor's lieutenants. That man did to her what Victor did to you. Slowly, methodically, building a cage one day at a time. I saw it happening. I told her to leave. I offered to help her. And she was going to, but on the night we were supposed to extract her, her husband killed her instead. Made it look like an accident. And then he disappeared into the organization, and Victor protected him. And I had to watch the woman I couldn't save get erased from history. Jasmine heard the weight of those words, heard the way they carried 5 years of accumulated guilt. That's not going to happen again, she said. No, Dmitri agreed. It's not. He turned to face her, and his expression had changed, softened. The cold professional exterior cracked just enough to show the human underneath. I need to tell you something, he said. Something that's going to sound crazy. Something that might change how you see me. Jasmine's heart was already racing. She understood what was coming before he said it. When I look at you, Dmitri continued, I don't just see a victim I need to save. I see someone who survived something that kills most people. I see someone who has the strength to testify against the man who destroyed her. I see someone who could actually help me heal from something that's been broken in me for 5 years. Jasmine waited for him to finish. Waited for the words that would change everything. I'm falling in love with you, he said. And I know that's wrong. I know that's complicated. I know that you're supposed to be grateful, and distant, and focused on recovery. But I'm telling you the truth because lies are what got us into this mess to begin with. Jasmine felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not gratitude. Something more complicated than either of those things. Something that felt like recognition, like understanding. Like maybe the universe had arranged this meeting not for her to be saved, but for both of them, to save each other. She crossed the distance between them and kissed him. Not because she'd planned to, not because it was the smart choice, but because sometimes the people who understand your damage are the only people who can ever actually reach you. They didn't make it to a bedroom. They stayed on the couch in the safe house living room, holding each other like neither of them believed the other was actually real. And for the first time since Victor had put his hands on her, Jasmine didn't feel afraid. She felt chosen. Her phone buzzed with another message from Victor. This one was different. This one was from the federal prison facility where he was being held. This one was shorter. I'm coming for you, it said. No matter how long it takes. Dmitri saw it, read it, and something in him shifted back to cold fury. That's the moment when we move to the final phase, he said quietly. That's the moment when this stops being about protecting you and starts being about destroying him completely. Outside, the woods were dark. Inside the safe house, everything felt like the last moment before an explosion. And Jasmine understood that the worst part was coming. But this time, she wouldn't face it alone. The confrontation happened in a way Jasmine didn't expect. Not at the safe house, not in some dramatic showdown, but in a holding facility where Victor was being transferred for a federal hearing. Dmitri had arranged it, had somehow pulled enough strings to make sure Jasmine could look him in the eyes before the trial, before the lawyers and the judges and the public spectacle, before everything became legal theater instead of truth. She wore a simple black dress, no makeup, no performance, just her face, marked with the evidence of what he'd done, completely visible. That was the most powerful thing Dmitri had told her. Don't hide. Let him see exactly what he created. The guard room had a viewing window. Bulletproof. Monitored. Victor sat handcuffed to a steel table, and when she walked in, his expression moved through 5 different emotions in the space of a second. Shock, fury, hunger, fear, and finally, understanding. "Hello, Jasmine," he said, his voice calm in the way that had once made her blood run cold. It still made her blood run cold, but now she recognized it for what it was. The voice of a man who'd lost his power and was pretending he hadn't. "I'm not Jasmine," she said, and her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. "That woman was someone you created. She was a ghost you invented, so you could sleep at night knowing what you'd done to her. I'm who I was before you, and I'm here to make sure you never get the chance to create another version of someone else." Victor's face darkened, the control cracking just slightly. "You think you've won," he said. "You think that testifying against me is going to change anything. But I have friends. I have people who owe me. And when I get out—" "You're not getting out," Jasmine said. "I've seen the evidence. I've seen the files. I've seen the photographs. And I've seen the testimony from the other women. You're not getting out, Victor. You're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell, thinking about all the things you can't control anymore." For the first time, she saw actual fear in his eyes. Not the calculated fear designed to manipulate. Real fear. The kind that came from understanding that consequences had finally caught up with you. "I'm going to testify," Jasmine continued. "I'm going to tell them about every time you hit me, every time you threatened me, every time you made me believe that leaving was impossible. And then I'm going to walk out of that courtroom, and I'm going to live the life you stole from me. And you're going to sit in a cell knowing that you failed, that you couldn't break me, that you couldn't keep me." She stood and walked toward the door. Victor started to speak, but she didn't listen. She didn't need to hear whatever manipulation or threat or promise he was about to make. She'd heard them all before, and they didn't matter anymore. When she stepped out of the holding room, Dmitri was waiting. His face was a mixture of pride and something else. Something that looked like love. Something that looked like healing. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," Jasmine corrected. "You gave me the power to do it. Now what?" "Now," Dmitri said, "we let the system do what it's supposed to do." The trial took 3 months. 3 months of Jasmine sitting in a witness stand while Victor's lawyers tried to dismantle her credibility. 3 months of her describing violence while Victor sat across the room in an expensive suit, looking like he'd been wrongfully accused. 3 months of the public learning exactly who Victor Kozlov was beneath the money and the power and the reputation. And on the final day, when the jury came back with their verdict, when the word guilty echoed through the courtroom, Jasmine felt something inside her shift. Not healing. That would take longer, but closure. The understanding that justice, for once, had actually worked the way it was supposed to work. Victor was sentenced to life in federal prison. No parole possibility. No light at the end of the tunnel. Just decades of cells and guards and the knowledge that he'd lost absolutely everything. As they led him away, he looked at Jasmine one final time. And in that look, she saw something that might have been respect. Respect for the fact that she'd refused to break. Respect for the fact that she'd won. She stood and walked out of the courtroom beside Dmitri, and for the first time in 7 years, she walked into sunlight that didn't feel dangerous. The apartment overlooked the river. It was the first place Jasmine chose for herself. Not suggested by anyone else, not arranged by Dmitri, just chosen by her, bought with her own money that had finally been returned to her once the federal seizure of Victor's assets had been completed. $4.2 billion. Her inheritance, her future. All of it finally back in her hands. She'd quit her job, not that she needed one, but because having work that was hers felt important. She'd opened a gallery, an actual gallery, filled with artwork from emerging artists who'd been overlooked by the major institutions. It was called Alicia's, named after the woman Dmitri couldn't save. Because sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to create something beautiful in their memory. The grand opening was on a Saturday night. The entire city showed up, critics and collectors and people who just wanted to see what all the attention was about. Jasmine wore a white dress, not because white meant purity or innocence, but because she'd chosen to wear white. That choice was all that mattered. Dmitri stood beside her the entire evening, and she noticed he no longer looked like a man who'd stepped out of the darkness. He looked like someone who'd chosen to step back into the light. He'd legitimized his business empire fully, had handed over his criminal connections to people he trusted to dissolve them properly, had begun the work of transforming himself from Victor's former enforcer into something else entirely. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, during a moment when they were both away from the crowd. "I'm proud of us," Jasmine corrected. They'd been living together for 6 months, had started therapy together, learning how to build a relationship that wasn't based on survival, but on actual choice. It was harder than Jasmine expected. Some days, she still flinched when Dmitri moved too quickly. Some days, she still woke up believing she was back in Victor's penthouse. Some days, the past felt more real than the present. But other days, she felt genuinely happy. Genuinely free. Genuinely like the person she'd been before Victor had found her. A reporter approached, someone from the local news. She wanted to do a story about Jasmine's gallery, about what it meant to open an art space dedicated to overlooked artists, about what it meant to build something beautiful after trauma. Jasmine almost said no, almost retreated into the safety of invisibility. But Dmitri squeezed her hand gently, reminding her that she'd already chosen visibility, already chosen to testify, already chosen to exist loudly in a world that would have preferred her to be silent. "Yes," Jasmine said. "I'll do the interview." As they set up cameras and lights, as the reporter asked her questions about her vision for the gallery, Jasmine realized something. She was telling her own story now. Not Victor's version of her. Not the story he'd created and controlled. Her actual story. The one where she'd survived. The one where she'd fought back. The one where she'd chosen love instead of fear. That evening, after the gallery had closed and the city had quieted down, Dmitri took her to the river. They sat on a bench, watching the water move, and he pulled out a small box. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know we're both broken in ways that are going to take years to heal. But I also know that I don't want to spend another day wondering what would happen if I didn't ask. So I'm asking now." Inside the box was a ring. Delicate, simple, nothing like the elaborate jewelry Victor had bought her. This was something chosen with intention, something that meant something. "Will you marry me?" Dmitri asked. Jasmine thought about her first wedding, about the makeup hiding bruises, about standing at an altar beside someone who owned her, about collapsing in front of 400 people, about all the ways that day had been a lie. "Yes," she said, "but I'm choosing the dress, and I'm choosing the date, and I'm choosing everything about it. Because this time, it's going to be real." Dmitri kissed her. And in that kiss was every moment of healing they'd done together, every moment of him proving he was different from Victor, every moment of her learning to trust again. Behind them, the city lights reflected off the water like diamonds. Ahead of them was a future that nobody had written for them. And for the first time in 7 years, Jasmine wasn't afraid of what that future held. She was excited about it. 1 year later, they were married in a small chapel overlooking the same river where he'd proposed. Jasmine wore a white dress that she'd chosen herself. She walked down the aisle by herself because she wanted to make an entrance that was hers alone. And when she reached the altar, Dmitri was there, not as a savior, but as a partner, not as a rescuer, but as someone choosing to build something with her. The vows were simple. No performance, no lies. Just two people who'd survived the worst parts of human nature, choosing to build something together anyway. After the ceremony, they held a reception at the gallery. Alicia's was decorated with flowers and light. The walls displayed artwork from emerging artists. And at one corner of the space, there was a photograph of Alicia, the woman Dmitri couldn't save. Because this joy, this happiness, this future, all of it was being lived partly for her. Victor watched from a prison cell 400 miles away. The news of Jasmine's marriage had reached him, as Jasmine had known it would. She'd made sure of it. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. He needed to understand that she'd completely moved on, that her life was no longer defined by what he'd done to her. The Ashford Chen Foundation had been established 6 months earlier. Using her inherited fortune, Jasmine had created a nonprofit dedicated to helping survivors of domestic violence. The foundation funded safe houses, provided legal support, trained advocates, gave women what Jasmine wished she'd had: immediate access to help without having to navigate a system that didn't believe them. It was named after the 7 years she'd lost. 7 years of freedom. The foundation was called because those were the years she'd never get back, and she was determined to make sure other women didn't lose the same amount of time to fear. In the year since Victor had been imprisoned, the foundation had helped 3,000 women. 3,000 women who'd found safety. 3,000 women who'd accessed legal resources. 3,000 women who'd discovered that there were people willing to fight for them. Jasmine stood in the gallery among her guests, her real friends, the ones who'd stayed, her team, who'd built something meaningful with her, Dimitri's family, who'd welcomed her with genuine warmth, and she felt something she'd never felt in Victor's presence: complete peace. Not because the trauma was gone. It would always be part of her. Not because the fear had disappeared entirely. Sometimes late at night, she still woke up believing she was back in his penthouse, but because she'd built a life that was authentically hers, because she'd made choices, because she'd survived. She thought about the makeup artist who'd noticed her bruises and said nothing. She thought about the nurse who'd left that card on her nightstand. She thought about the federal agents who'd arrested Victor. She thought about Dmitri, who'd seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to help her anyway. She thought about Alicia, the woman she'd never met, but whose memory now helped thousands of other women find their way out. And she thought about herself, the person she'd been when she walked into that ballroom, invisible and terrified. That woman had collapsed in front of 400 people, and in that collapse, she'd finally been seen. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from a woman she'd helped through the foundation. Just 2 words: "Thank you." That was enough. That had always been enough. The knowledge that her pain, once transformed, could become medicine for someone else's wound. Dmitri found her on the gallery balcony, looking out at the city that had nearly destroyed her and had ultimately saved her instead. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "Beyond happy," Jasmine replied. "I'm alive. Actually alive. Not just surviving. Not just pretending. Actually, truly living." They stood together as the sun set over the city, casting everything in gold. And in that golden light, Jasmine understood something fundamental. The collapse had been the beginning, not the end. The moment she'd fallen had been the moment she'd finally started to rise. If Jasmine's story moved you, if you see yourself in her journey, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on your notifications, because next video, we're bringing you another story that will shake you, another story about someone who refused to disappear, another story about the power of choosing yourself. Share this story in the comments. Tell Jasmine you see her. Tell her she's not alone. And more importantly, if you're watching this and you're living in a cage disguised as love, reach out. Tell someone. Choose yourself. You deserve better. You deserve freedom. That's what Jasmine learned, and that's what you need to hear too.